Under no circumstances, you are promising America tonight, you would never abuse power as retribution against anybody.
Except for day one.
Except
Look,
for?
he's going crazy. Except for day one.
Meaning?
I want to close the border, and I want to drill.
That's
drill,
not. That's
drill.
That's not.
No, no.
That's not retribution.
I'm going to be. You know, he keeps. We love this guy. He says, "You're not going to be a dictator, are you?" I said, "No, no, no. Other than day one, we're closing the border, and we're drilling, drilling, drilling. After that, I'm not a dictator."
So
okay?
that sounds to me like you're going back to the policies.
That was President-elect Donald Trump at a town hall with Fox News host Sean Hannity almost a year ago. Now, Trump has won re-election, and that day one is approaching. So I asked my colleague Yasmin Abutaleb, who covers politics here at The Post, just what we might expect on January 20th, 2025, Trump's very first day back in office.
I think the most striking thing about Trump's win this time is he is going to go into office much more prepared and much more organized than he did when he entered in 2017 for his first term. And so I think what a lot of people learned during his run this time was to take what he said he was going to do seriously and literally. A quick list of what we've heard at various points includes closing the border, mass deportations.
On day one, I will launch the largest deportation program in American history. I will rescue every city and town that has been invaded and conquered, and we will...
Cutting taxes for corporations and wealthy individuals.
We're going to be paying down debt. We're going to be reducing taxes.
Banning gender-affirming care for minors.
On day one, I will revoke Joe Biden's cruel policies on so-called gender-affirming care. Ridiculous. A process that...
And there are other sort of congressional actions like repealing the Affordable Care Act that have come up in the last few weeks.
First day back. I'm going to be signing so many different mandates on my first day back.
And of course, that's just what he's talked about for day one. So now you have to wonder, what about the next day? From the newsroom of The Washington Post, this is Post Reports. I'm Martine Powers. It's Thursday, November 7th. Today on the show, we're going to talk through what Trump has said about what he would do during his second presidency. From how he would handle the wars in Ukraine and Gaza, to what he thinks putting tariffs on imports would actually achieve, to how he would deal with his quote-unquote enemies. And we'll talk about how he could reshape the federal government to give himself the power to actually make these sweeping policy changes. So, Yasmin, as we just heard, Trump has talked somewhat extensively about his plans for his first day in office and things that he wants to try to achieve from the get-go. How can we expect him to use his presidential powers to put these proposals in action?
Well, when we're talking about immigration, I think that's maybe the most important place to start, because I think if you look at the list of promises, that was probably the key one that powered him to the presidency. And you saw Kamala Harris and Democrats having to adjust their message on immigration through the course of the campaign because they saw how popular Trump's was, talking about mass deportation and shutting the border. He has also said that he would repeal DACA, which protects people who came to the United States as children without authorization and have spent the vast majority of their lives here. The big difference from Trump 8 years ago and Trump now is when Trump came into office the first time, they didn't fully understand how to use the levers of government, and it took them some time to figure out how to do all that. This time, there's been a systemic plan in place that he has tried to distance himself from, called Project 2025, which is this 900-page document that came from the Heritage Foundation. Trump tried to distance himself from this plan as it became a Democratic attack line. We know that his vice president, J.D. Vance, embraced it at various points, and that the people who wrote this plan will probably come join this administration and start enacting at least parts of it. And so on immigration, there's a lot he can do through executive authority. But the other important thing is Trump might possibly have unified control of government. We don't know yet. The Senate has been called for Republicans. The House has not been called, and it's a very tight race, but Republicans could potentially also retain control of the House. So Trump can also try to push through pretty quickly some of his most ambitious plans through Congress.
And then what we saw at the beginning of the Trump administration and this travel ban that he attempted to put in, though it wasn't ultimately that effective. Are we expecting another travel ban? Is he going to come in basically starting with that again?
He has vowed to reinstate the travel ban, which was in the first term from several Muslim-majority countries. And he did that pretty much within the first week, which I think was one of those things that people thought he was saying but wouldn't actually do. We started hearing about it because all of a sudden people who were traveling back to the United States couldn't get in and were getting stopped at the airport.
The president has ordered all travelers from Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen to be denied entry to the United States for the next 90 days.
Thousands of protesters have descended on airports across the country.
Lawyers and legal advocates stand in front of the arrival exit in O'Hare's International Terminal with signs offering free legal help in Arabic and English.
And over the next 24, 48, 72 hours, we saw lawyers rushing to the airport, panicked families going, trying to figure out what was happening with their loved ones. And we had these scenes of chaos for a few days as that plan was taking effect. And it ended up being stopped in the courts. But he has promised to bring back a version of that and potentially an expanded version of that.
When I return to office, the travel ban is coming back even bigger than before and much stronger than before.
They've also talked about cracking down on employers, hiring foreign-born seasonal workers. So a lot of this agenda will focus on limiting the number of people who can come into the United States.
All right. So that's what he's thinking on immigration. Then I want to talk about the economy, especially because what we heard from voters is so many people ended up voting for Trump because they felt like the economy was better when he was president the first time, that they're hopeful that if he's president again, that it'll mean something meaningfully better for their personal financial lives. What actions is Trump going to take immediately to improve the economy?
Yeah, I will say it's interesting that voters did not seem to hold him responsible for his final year in office when the economy was doing quite poorly because of the pandemic. So they were really thinking about those first 3 years. Trump, probably his biggest economic promises have been tariffs on all U.S. imports. And he says this will bring manufacturing back to the United States. A lot of economists have warned this is actually going to drive up prices for Americans.
And when you say tariffs on U.S. imports, like, what does that mean? Can you give me an example of what that would look like?
It's basically taxing any product that comes in from outside of the United States. And Trump says the purpose of this is to incentivize U.S. manufacturing and for people to buy products made in the United States. I think the problem and practice with that is that so many goods come in from outside of the United States that economists have said tariffs on all U.S. imports. I mean, if you think about what comes in, a lot of groceries come in from overseas, like fruits and vegetables that are not necessarily produced here, not during certain seasons. And then lots of consumer goods like electronics come in from overseas, that this is actually going to raise prices on everyday goods for Americans. But Trump is saying he's going to do this to bring back manufacturing to the United States.
And is that something that Trump can do by himself, or does he need Congress and the fact that Republicans now have control of the Senate, at least, like that could help him? But like, does he need other folks to be able to help him do this, or is this something that he can unilaterally do himself?
My understanding is there are parts of this that can be done through executive order because, you know, Trump did impose some tariffs in his first term that Biden then never revoked. And depending on how ambitious the plan is, some of this might have to go through Congress. But there is quite a bit he could do through the executive branch.
I also want to talk about taxes because, of course, that is one of the things that Trump was effectively able to do during his first term in office. And I think something that a lot of people have looked back to and said, Trump cut taxes and like there's more of that to come when he's president again. What does that part of his agenda look like in terms of taxes for Americans, for poor Americans, rich Americans, and for American companies?
This was also a big part of Trump's economic message. And the thing is, the tax cuts are mostly going to be for the richest Americans. He's talked about cutting taxes for corporations, for top earners. And I think there was this perception among some Americans that their taxes would ultimately be cut too. And who knows, this is one that will have to go through Congress. And now that Republicans could very likely have unified control of Congress. It would not be surprising if this was a top priority, because this is something the Republican Party can all sort of get behind. But most of the tax cuts would disproportionately go to corporations and the top earners. I don't know if they would throw something in there that might be a slight middle class tax cut so that people feel it too. But when we're talking about a $5 trillion bill or however much it is mostly geared towards millionaires, billionaires, and big businesses.
Let's talk for a second about the environment. I think most people are probably aware of Donald Trump's feelings about climate change, his sense that this is not a risk or something that we should be worried about. And a lot of his policies have reflected that. What are we expecting from him in terms of policies that he's planning to do that would have a direct impact on climate change?
Well, under President Biden, Democrats passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which had hundreds of billions of dollars of climate initiatives. Trump has promised to roll all of those back. So that would be one massive change that could take place right away, because a lot of these changes are dependent on the federal government actually implementing them and distributing funding. Even though this has been passed by Congress, the federal government has to carry it out. And then, of course, in the tape we listened to at the beginning, he talked about drill, drill, drill. So Trump has talked a lot about drilling in more places in the United States, and this would have a direct impact on the climate.
And then just along those lines, I saw reporting on some of what had come out in the Project 2025 that you mentioned earlier, specifically about hurricane forecasting and this potential that the government may no longer do forecasting for hurricanes and other major weather events. What's that all about?
Yeah, this is sort of a more strange one. It's part of a suite of dramatic proposals to reshape and in many ways eviscerate the federal government. And so part of Project 2025 proposes getting rid of the agency that does hurricane forecasts. I'm not quite
Why?
I'm not quite sure the reasons for it, but that would be a dramatic change too. And I do think it's worth noting that during the campaign, when these twin hurricanes hit in the final stretch of the campaign, Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina and Georgia and parts of Florida, and then Hurricane Milton, Trump did seize on those to spread quite a bit of misinformation about the federal response. I'm not saying these things are connected. I just think it's worth noting some of Trump's strange mixed history when it comes to natural disasters and the consequences of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that question of the federal government and how the federal government could change under Trump and his desire to make it smaller, to eliminate federal jobs. Paint a picture of what he has described here, of what he wants to achieve.
The top line here is that if the Trump administration acts on what they have laid out in Project 2025, this would be the most dramatic reshaping of the federal government in U.S. history. Trump is talking about eliminating the education department altogether. He is talking about installing only loyalists throughout the federal government. And to just be very clear for people who might not know, the federal government is stocked with tens of thousands of employees who are nonpartisan, who stay in agencies regardless of who's president, whether it changes hands. The federal government is made up of so many jobs that a president could not possibly appoint every single person across every single agency every time the government changes hands. So you have political appointees who run agencies and divisions of agencies, but the people who actually make them up are federal employees who tend to be in those jobs for a long time. Trump is talking about loyalty tests, about purging anyone who they deem not loyal to him. He was very frustrated in his first term by civil servants who sometimes stopped or stymied many of his more extreme proposals.
Wait, what does a loyalty test look like? Is it like that he'd give people, I don't know, a piece of paper that would say, like, do you swear to do whatever Trump or your Trump-appointed boss tells you to do no matter what?
I mean, I think a big part of what they're looking for is anyone who's ever expressed any type of opposition to Trump in the past, anyone who might not sort of blindly carry out parts of his agenda. I mean, this is really going to be one of the most fundamental changes from a first Trump term to a second Trump term. Even beyond the federal government, if we look at some of his White House appointments, those were people who were not necessarily loyal to him. They were traditional Republicans who he brought in. John Kelly, his former chief of staff, is probably the best example. Trump is not going to do that a second time. He is not going to bring in more traditional Republicans. He is only going to bring in people who have sort of expressed loyalty and fealty to him and have stood by him, or at least sort of, even if they abandoned him after January 6th, have come back and made their way back into his good graces. These are the only people he wants to populate the federal government. He does not want anyone who's going to resist his agenda or him or some of his authoritarian impulses in any way.
Well, let me ask this, because I think it's so important to be aware of what Trump has said and what he is expressing he wants to achieve in the second term, and to know that a lot of this stuff could happen. But also, so much of this rings super familiar. Like, I remember in 2016 when there was this fear that Trump was going to have the size of the federal government and all these people would be out of jobs. And that didn't really happen. And talking about mass deportations. And there were a lot of, frightening and I think a lot of people would say horrible things that did happen under the first Trump administration when it comes to family separations at the border. But in terms of mass deportations or immigration officials going door to door to kick people out of this country, that also didn't happen the way that Trump had projected. And so I guess what would your response be to a sense of skepticism that I think some people have of well, he was president once, he said he wanted to do it and he didn't do it that time. So why should we be so worried about it now? I mean, Trump just talks a lot about stuff that he can't actually achieve.
It's a fair question. There were a lot of things he promised in the first term that did not ultimately come to pass. I think there's two parts to this answer. So the first part of what's different this time is Trump is not a novice to the presidency and to the federal government. So what happened in the first Trump term is there was a lot of time where they were trying to do things, but he had a lot of people in senior positions who had never been in government, who didn't understand how it worked. So they would try to implement things like the travel ban and then be immediately stopped by the courts. Or they had people in different parts of the government who stopped some of the more extreme proposals or plans. I think the difference this time is there is a clear roadmap of how they want to come in and dismantle parts of the federal government one by one. The second part of this question is that there are still checks and balances throughout the country. Some of what Trump tries to do, whether a mass deportation program or family separation or things on the border, could very well end up in federal courts and end up being stopped or paused. There has been a lot of transformation from his first term to now. Republicans have stocked a lot of the federal courts, but Biden also appointed a lot of federal judges. There are still courts and other systems in place that could slow or stymie parts of Trump's agenda.
After the break, I talk with Yasmin about other Trump agenda items, how he'd approach abortion, foreign policy, and his many so-called enemies. We'll be right back. Yasmin, let's talk for a second about abortion. Because when you think about what Trump was actually successful on in his first term, the fact that he was able to appoint Supreme Court justices that eventually ruled in Dobbs and overturned Roe v. Wade, I mean, you could argue that that was one of his biggest achievements, is to basically limit or remove abortion access in a significant part of the country. We know that Americans are pretty mixed right now on the issue of abortion. I mean, we saw these ballot questions, many of which passed on Tuesday, where people, even in some conservative states, voted to protect abortion access. So where does that leave Trump? What is he going to do, if anything, on abortion when he gets into office?
This is a great question, Martine, because I think we actually are not 100% sure of that answer. Trump himself could not figure out how to talk about abortion throughout the course of the campaign. Mm-hmm. Even his own advisors would acknowledge this was probably his weakest policy issue.
Though I think there's an argument to make that it actually helped him in that a lot of people who voted for him, even if they favored abortion access, they were like, well, Trump doesn't really even seem like he knows what he wants when it comes to abortion. So that's not a reason to not vote for him.
It's true. It's true. He did manage to sort of distance himself from some Republicans who are more tied to things like abortion bans that are fairly unpopular because he was all over the map. So you'd see Trump through the course of the campaign support an abortion ban, and then he would back off of it. He generally sort of deferred back to this position where he said it should be up to the states, which is what's happening now. But you see many states implementing, pretty much total abortion bans. So Trump said at the end of the campaign that he would veto a national abortion ban. But there are things the federal government can do that would still have a direct impact on abortion access. I think the biggest thing is the Food and Drug Administration plays a huge role in access to mifepristone, which is the abortion pill. And part of Project 2025 does stipulate that they would try to restrict access and availability of the abortion pill.
So basically through the executive branch and through control of the Food and Drug Administration, that could be a way of limiting abortion access rather than going like the legislative route.
Exactly. There are things that can be done through the federal government, even things that are a little bit wonkier but have huge consequences, like whether or not hospital providers are protected if they provide certain types of reproductive care to a woman whose life is in danger in a state that has an abortion ban. There are a lot of open legal questions. And in states with these bans, doctors are often faced with these questions where they don't know at what point they can intervene if a woman's having a pregnancy complication that's threatening her life. So there is still quite a bit, maybe not in the sort of big way that people think about in terms of a national abortion ban, that the federal government could still play a sizable role in reproductive care access.
That's so interesting. I want to talk for a second about foreign policy, what the Trump presidency means for Ukraine and what it means for Israel and Gaza.
So U.S. allies have had pretty mixed reactions to Trump being elected. We know in Europe and among NATO allies, there was extreme anxiety about the idea of a second Trump term because he has threatened to leave NATO, to significantly weaken it.
For years, we were paying almost all of NATO. We were being ripped off by European nations, both on trade and on NATO. I got them to pay up by saying one of the statements you made before, if you don't pay, we're not going to protect you. Otherwise, we would have.
He does not feel strongly about traditional U.S. alliances in the way previous presidents have. So I think there is this expectation that there could potentially be an upending of sort of traditional U.S. foreign policy and U.S. alliances that have persisted for the last 75 years. On Ukraine, Trump has expressed skepticism of continuing funding for Ukraine. And we know that funding for Ukraine will start to run out at the end of this year. Ukraine does not have a lot more runway from the U.S. past this year.
Wow.
And Trump has expressed sympathy with Putin. He has talked about Ukraine needing to make concessions. And he and his vice president, J.D. Vance, have been huge skeptics of continued U.S. funding and sending weapons to Ukraine. So I think on Ukraine, there is anxiety that Trump could force Ukraine to take a deal that makes them concede a lot of land or try to pressure them to take a deal that makes them concede a lot of land, one that is more favorable to Russia. So we'll see that how that plays out. But Trump and Vance have sort of led a movement within the Republican Party to become quite skeptical of supporting Ukraine in general.
Yeah. But then what about Israel? I feel like it's a completely different kind of calculus there.
Trump has been talking out of both sides of his mouth when it comes to Israel. So while he was campaigning, he visited Arab and Muslim communities in Michigan where he'd promised peace, he'd promised an end to the war. But then we know from reporting from our colleagues that he spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in October and told him, do what you need to do. And he expressed support for both the Israeli offensive in Gaza against Hamas and for the Israeli offensive in Lebanon against Hezbollah. And he said that he was impressed by Israel's operation that saw pagers that Hezbollah used explode. So Trump, on the one hand, has said he wants the war to end. There has been reporting that he has told Netanyahu he wants the war over by the time he is sworn in. But at the same time, he's told Netanyahu, do whatever it is you need to do. And in his first term, Trump gave Israel pretty much everything it wanted. He moved the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. He allowed them to annex the Golan Heights. And we know that Netanyahu very much wanted a Trump presidency.
Oh, interesting. Because, I mean, you could argue that, Biden and Netanyahu had a relatively close relationship as relationships between foreign leaders go. And this thought that Biden would be able to influence Netanyahu in this, has turned out not to be true. And so I guess the question of, if Trump comes in and is like, okay, Now, because I'm about to be president, you really got to just wrap this up. Like, does Netanyahu care? And is that going to have any effect at all?
There are, I think, two schools of thought on that, both in the U.S. and Israeli society. There is this idea that Netanyahu is going to want to give Trump some of what he wants in order to get maybe longer-term goals that he wants. There's what if Netanyahu wants to annex the West Bank or parts of the West Bank? Does Netanyahu basically say he's wrapping up the war and then continue carrying out low-level operations? Biden had such an emotional, visceral attachment to Israel that he never wanted to cut off arms. Trump does not have that same attachment. So on the one hand, Trump, was extremely friendly to Israel when he was president. On the other hand, he doesn't have the same sort of historical, emotional attachment that Biden did. And he's sent these mixed messages. So I think on Israel, it's a little bit less clear what Trump is going to end up doing.
Okay, one last question about what the beginning of a second Trump presidency will look like. And that's about the idea of revenge. You talked earlier about loyalty and about how Trump is going to, from what we understand, surround himself with people who he believes have proven their loyalty to him. But for the people who haven't, or the people who have proven their willingness to oppose him, what happens to those folks? I mean, I'm thinking, for example, like former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, or people that Trump has called out as people who he thinks are his enemy. What is it going to look like when he is president again and is in a position to exact some form of revenge?
This was also a big part of Trump's campaign, especially in the sort of closing weeks. He really doubled down on grievances and the people he called his political enemies or political opponents. So we can just go through what he said he was going to do. He has said he is going to use the Justice Department to go after his political enemies. That includes Joe Biden and his family. It includes people who have opposed him in the past, including some former officials. When speaking about former Republican Congresswoman Liz Cheney, he said that she should have guns trained on her face.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. When the guns are trained on her face.
And he's also said that he would use the American military to go after domestic opponents.
I think the bigger problem are the people from within. We have some very bad people. We have some sick people, radical left lunatics. And I think they're and it should be very easily handled by, if necessary, by National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military.
The ones he named specifically were former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Democratic Congressman, soon-to-be Senator, Adam Schiff.
And he can just do that?
I think we're entering untested waters here. We've never had a president or presidential candidate say they are going to do these things or try to do these things. And the other part of this that's unprecedented is Trump is going into office with more legal protection than ever. The Supreme Court came down with a really critical ruling earlier this year that said presidents are immune from prosecution for actions that they commit in office. This has sort of given Trump carte blanche to do whatever it is he wants in office because he now has legal protection from it, which has come down from the Supreme Court.
Yasmeen, thank you so much for talking through all this.
Thank you.
Yasmeen Abu Talib is a White House reporter for The Post. Before we go, a couple other pieces of news from today. Shortly before noon, President Biden addressed the nation for the first time since Trump was declared the next president. Biden talked about his commitment to a peaceful transition of power.
We accept the choice the country made. I've said many times, you can't love your country only when you win. You can't love your neighbor only when you agree.
And Biden went on to address Democratic supporters.
Remember, a defeat does not mean we are defeated. We lost this battle. The America of your dreams is calling for you to get back up. That's the story of America for over 240 years and counting.
Biden's message comes at a moment when there's a lot of finger-pointing among Democrats who are trying to figure out how they lost so decisively and whether Biden himself might be partly to blame. As you heard Yasmin mention earlier, we are still waiting for a final tally of results from congressional races around the country that will determine which party will hold the majority in the House of Representatives. As it stands, there are about 24 seats in competitive races that still do not have a named winner. But for those seats that have been called, a couple notable additions. Delaware made history by electing Sarah McBride, a 34-year-old Democrat who will become the first openly transgender member of Congress. And Democrat Eugene Vindman won Virginia's 7th congressional district in a very close race. Vindman is perhaps best known as a former national security official who, along with his twin brother, became a whistleblower in Trump's first impeachment. And that's it for today's episode of Post Reports. Thanks for listening. And if you want more reactions and insights about the election results, I highly recommend the latest episode of our opinions podcast, Impromptu. This week, columnists Ruth Marcus, Dana Milbank, and James Hohman are unpacking the question of why Trump won.
What role did Kamala Harris's race and gender play in all of this? And I ask that from the perspective of someone who has written not one, but two spiked columns, one in 2016 and one just yesterday about the magnificent election of the first woman president.
We could have like a book of your columns, of your spiked columns of like the America that wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah. If only by Ruth Marcus.
No, you have a sort of a little subspecialty in that. That's terrific.
Again, that's from the Washington Post opinion podcast, Impromptu. Subscribe to their show wherever you get your podcasts. Today's episode of Post Reports was produced by Emma Talkoff and Ariel Plotnick, with help from Bishop Sand. It was mixed by Rennie Svirnovsky and edited by Monica Campbell, with help from Rena Flores. Thanks to Gina Harkins. I'm Martine Powers. We'll be back tomorrow with more stories from the Washington Post.